to another edition of the Last Negroes at Harvard podcast. There were 18 of us in the Harvard College class of 1963. We are all over 82 years old now, and for the last 4 years, we have produced a weekly podcast. Our guest today is Geoffrey Wawro. He is a historian. He is a professor at the University of North Texas in Denton, Texas. His book is titled The Vietnam War, A Military History. Professor Wawro, thank you for joining us. Welcome, and tell us about the book and your career.
Well, I'm very interested to hear about all of you. I went to Brown, class of '83, so I feel like I'm exactly 20 years younger than all of you. And I can see that I have a lot of good years ahead of me, hearing about what you're all doing. But as relates to the war, I was born in 1960, so I'm the youngest of seven. So I had four older brothers, three of whom were, draft eligible, and were, very worried about the war. One was thinking about, one got like a heart murmur, so he didn't have to go. The other one was going to go to Canada, were threatening to go to Canada. The other one was just, he was over at school in England for a year as an English-speaking Union scholar, and he kept going. He would use the excuse of checking his draft status to go into London to party on the weekends because he was at an all-boys boarding school. Yeah. But anyway, the point is and then that brother, the one that was in England, he had been like on the football team at the school I went to in Connecticut, Loomis Chaffee, and he got kicked off the team for posting a notice saying, "Don't go to practice today because it's the moratorium," right? And so the coach, who was a real, hawkish, hard hat type guy, kicked him off the team. He played a vanishing position, fullback. So, and then just, that was the golden age of print media, as you know. So, and my parents got, Time, Life, Newsweek. They even got Perry Match. So we would have these things lying on the coffee table with those, images of Vietnam everywhere. And then, of course, you'd see it on the news all the time. As in my family, we were limited to 1 hour of television in a week. So I saved my hour for The Wonderful World of Disney.
It's interesting. I went to school in England for a year with the English-speaking Union, and I also got to go to London on the weekends because I met a young consular officer who was sympathetic to my plight being in this terrible school, and he kept sending me letters saying, "You have to come to London to check in for your draft card." The school had a hard time believing how bureaucratic the U.S. was, but I was deeply grateful.
So what school were you at in England?
St. Edmund's School, Canterbury.
Okay, nice.
School for orphans of the Anglican clergy. You can what a party school that was.
So anyway, so I said we were limited to an hour a week, but I would go to friends' houses and I would watch the evening news and see stuff from. So my point is I really felt, as if I was marinating in this war as a boy, and we played we played Army in the backyard and all that stuff. So I kind of just grew up very much aware of it. But as a historian, I got my PhD at Yale and worked with Paul Kennedy and Sir Michael Howard and really was doing, the strategy and diplomacy of the great powers. And my dissertation was on the Austro-Prussian War of 1866. And that led to a book on the Franco-Prussian War later. So I was really more in European history, but this book on the Middle East I wrote really interested me more and more in American history. Not least because European archives have just gotten so bad in terms of, user friendliness. And whereas, the American archives are very accessible and very easy to work in. And also I just found teaching as a professor, students are much more enlivened by American history. So I found myself pulled into that for a lot of reasons. But so Vietnam War was something I always wanted to write about. And I think, that resolution came from, I was 7 years at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, and one of the case studies that we spent 2 weeks on it. We revised the syllabus every summer. The students were most interested in this more, as much as if not more than any other, was Vietnam. And basically the method there was you had some lectures, you had some just sort of seminar discussion, but really it would culminate in a role-playing episode where like half the class would play the role of the United States and half the class would play the role of communist North Vietnam, and you would kind of workshop how to win the war. And it was striking how each time like the group that was playing the Americans would win the war by doing all the things that Johnson didn't do, by going into Cambodia and Laos and hitting North Vietnam really hard and mining Haiphong Harbor, unleashing the bombers and that sort of thing. And so I was left with this impression that the war was totally winnable and all we had to do was do those things. And if Johnson hadn't been so weak-kneed, it would have worked out. And then so when I got into the archives and there's been so much that's been declassified since the last sort of general histories of the war were written, I was able to really like look at the war from the perspective of decision makers at the time. In other words, instead of just sort of extrapolating like we did in that seminar, oh, we could have done this or we could have done that, seeing what was actually feasible. And what struck me was that none of that was feasible. If you just look at the power available to the United States, which was virtually unlimited. I mean, we were generating 40% of world GDP at the time, compared to like half that today. And we just said, little pieces of American power would have been sufficient to, stymie North Vietnam, but not beat North Vietnam, because I'll be happy to get into it in more detail, but there was just no way for us to fight the war in North Vietnam, in Laos, in Cambodia, and South Vietnam, given the tail to tip ratio of the U.S. military, where you were basically having 10 guys in support functions for every guy in combat. So, McNamara kept looking at this puzzle and saying, there's no way I can get more combat troops into Vietnam without massively expanding the draft and without calling the reserves the National Guard. And these things were all, these things were all anathema to all the presidents involved, because they would have so disturbed the American society. So it was very revealing writing the book. And I don't like name names. People know who they are, but there's a lot of kind of revisionist historians out there. Someone like, say, Mark Moyer, who are claiming like, it was a lost victory, triumph restored, blah, blah, blah. But, what I find is comical about that is that what is their method? Their method is to basically go into the archives and find the same kind of phony numbers that the various administrations used to assert that we were winning, and the various MACV commanders used to assert that we were winning, and say, you see, we were winning. We were about to win, and then the presidents, lost their will and pulled out prematurely, and therefore it all went to hell. But, what I found, what was fascinating was that these phony numbers that they were submitting to Washington, everybody in MACV knew they were phony. MACV had teams of inspectors, real professionals, Army officers, Air Force officers, Marine officers, that would like tour the provinces, and they would go into ARVN headquarters, they would go into American headquarters, or they would go into, regional popular militia headquarters, and they would assess everything, or they would go study the Phoenix program to see how the Phoenix program was progressing. And they would always come back and say, everything here is bullshit. None of this is real. And they would detail the methods that were being used, how slapdash and unserious they were. So, but then up at the higher levels, like Westmoreland, Abrams, they would take the raw numbers that look good and just send those on to Washington as signs of progress. And meanwhile, in Washington, they also knew the numbers were all bullshit, right? So, because McNamara famously had his Office of Systems Analysis, where he would run the numbers that were being provided by MACV and realize that there was just no way that they were true. And then also they just had a lot of clear thinking people around the SecDef and in the White House who were saying, no, this is all this, and they would say, okay, well, what can we do to turn things around? And they would wrestle with that. And they just saw no way, given the disparity between American will, American stamina, and North Vietnamese will and stamina. They said that these guys are going to go on forever, and they're under this very authoritarian regime of Lee Zuan, because Ho Chi Minh had been pushed out of the picture in the 66, 67. He's been replaced by Lee Zuan and Lee Zuan is just brutal, and he's willing to fight as long as it takes. And they have the manpower to absorb really crushing body count losses.
Can I ask or make a comment or ask a question? One thing that the Pentagon Papers seem to reveal, and you have now seen much more than the Pentagon Papers, I guess, is that the people who were running the war already knew that the United States couldn't win. And in fact, they kept the war going for domestic reasons because they couldn't face giving up on the war. But they knew it was not a winning proposition. Now that applies to the Johnson administration. I recall meeting Daniel Ellsberg just before the Pentagon Papers came out. And he made the comment that there wasn't a single person in the government who could pass a freshman quiz on the history of Vietnam, that nobody knew anything about Vietnamese society who invited the government. And I remember in one of our demonstrations in Washington, I met with Bundy's assistant. And it was quite clear that this man had, who was, I forgot his name, Chester Cooper or something. He really knew nothing about the history of Vietnam, in the recent history, and certainly not the long-range history and culture of Vietnam.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was something that Kennedy was very aware of, that America was knew too little about the place and had invested too much faith in Ngo Dinh Diem, including Kennedy as a senator who'd called Diem the savior of Vietnam, and the vital third force candidate who would kind of maneuver between the poles of communism and French influence, and would represent real Vietnamese nationalist thinking. But then he turns out to be a real dud in that he empowers his family circle and turns out to be very, authoritarian and corrupt, and bases himself on the minority of South Vietnamese who are Roman Catholics, and then, and alienates everyone else. But Kennedy was well aware of this, that America just didn't know enough about the conflict, and just as important, didn't have the means to turn this thing around. And so that's why Kennedy kept it going merely as an exercise to kind of burnish his national security credentials, to say that he was being tough on communism, that he was containing the spread of communism. But he's very careful not to insert ground troops, and not even to insert a lot of air power. He sent planes, and he sent American pilots, and he sent advisors, vastly expanded the corps of advisors in South Vietnam. But he was careful not to make a formal commitment, because he knew that the tendency of the military was to take a small commitment, and leverage it into a large one to get more appropriations, more boots on the ground, more aircraft, and just bigger budgets. So he was very careful. And Johnson had none of that, because Johnson comes in and says, well, the problem with this war is that we haven't been fighting it hard enough. So let's just go in and get it over with. And, Johnson is egged on by, his likely Republican rivals in 64, people like Barry Goldwater or Ronald Reagan, who are saying things like, I don't understand why it's taking us so long to beat this, fourth-rate little country. We should just go in and get it over with. And Johnson shares that view, that we got to just go in and, as he puts it, nail the coonskins to the wall. And but then he's pretty rapidly disabused of that, because he he really ramps up manpower in Vietnam, from 1,000 or so advisors under JFK, and then by 1968, he's got 543,000 troops in Vietnam. He's got 120,000 in 66, 400,000 in 67, 543, and so he's like massively increasing, and all those increases come with equivalent increases in warships of the Sixth Fleet and Air Force bombers and strike fighters. So and yet none of it really moves the needle. We arrive at a situation that was that was noticed when we got in there with a lot of force, that the war was militarily unlosable, because there was no way that the North Vietnamese could beat the United States in that kind of force in South Vietnam. But it was also militarily unwinnable, that we couldn't convert this kind of holding action into any kind of decisive win that would result in a lasting peace and a two-state solution for Vietnam.
Yeah, so I guess from the discussion so far, it's probably clear that most of us on this call, back in the 60s at least, were opposed to the war in Vietnam. Certainly I was, even though I was not an activist in any way, but in terms of my cognitive attitudes about the war, it seemed like it was something that was necessary. And then and I maintained that viewpoint for 25 years or so. And then I stumbled across a book by Michael Lind, which was published in 1999, called Vietnam, A Necessary War. And I read this book, and it sort of blew me away, because what this guy did is he went through every single argument that he could think of, or that had been prominent at the time, of why the war in Vietnam should not have been fought. And he produced all this evidence that suggested that, in fact, all of these arguments were not good from a historical perspective, and that the war, it was a necessary war. And the problem with the war was not that it wasn't important to have conducted it. The problem was that the war itself was not conducted in the right manner to win. And so I'd like it, I would really appreciate if you would comment about this book by Michael Lind and what you think about that, and whether you would agree that it was a war that should have been fought. It's just that it wasn't fought correctly.
Well, I mean, I haven't read his book, but it sounds to me like he's doing, what, say, Louis Sorley did in his book, A Better War, or what, as I mentioned earlier, Mark Moyer, Triumph Regained, Triumph Restored, and in which case they take the sort of top line data supplied to the White House from MACV, showing more villages pacified, more VC infrastructure cadres neutralized, more militia forces armed, more ARVN units declared capable, and they say, "Oh, you see, things were trending up, for South Vietnam, and then we just lost heart and bailed out too early." It's not. Is that kind of the argument he makes, that we were on a run, and that we just kind of pooped out? Is that?
Well, it's been 20 or 30 years since I read the book.
Yeah. Well,
so I don't remember the details. I really remember is that I was very disturbed by this book, not because I felt that it was, not a good book, or not well written, or that its arguments were poor, but just simply that because it made me think that the attitude I always had from the war, from the time I was in college for 20 or 25 years thereafter, that perhaps I was wrong.
yeah. Well, so again, I haven't read. I know who he is. I haven't read his book, but I assume he does this thing that others have done, which is to sort of show improving data and say, if only we had stayed the course, and also if only we had taken sterner measures. And I won't reiterate what I said earlier, but I looked at this situation, and where you have in 1968 543,000 troops in Vietnam, which only gives you about 50 to 60,000 combat troops on any given day. And not all those guys are in combat because a lot of them are resting. They're not always in the field. So you've got a third, in the field, a third resting, a third, training, and to go back in. So that's why I say you could add another 1,000,000 troops, and that would give you maybe 100,000 combat troops, right? Because of the need to have all those support functions, the clerks and jerks, the rear echelon mother, effers. So where do you find this manpower? You had 7 active duty infantry, army divisions and 2 Marine divisions in Vietnam when the war was at its peak. That was most of the active duty strength. There was no reserve left over in the United States. What was there was earmarked for NATO and for places like Korea. So you couldn't the only available division was the 82nd Air Corps Division. That's the one that was guarding the White House when all the protests broke out about the Cambodian incursion, and guarding the executive office building. That was the only available division, and one of its brigades was in Vietnam. So there was no force to increase to have a wider war in Cambodia and Laos, and as Westmoreland hopefully put it, do an Inchon-like incursion into North Vietnam. There was no force. So where are you going to fight it? Same with the Air Force, same with the Navy, stretched to the max. And another kind of discovery in my book was that I look at the readiness of American forces around the world, and there's a readiness crisis in every command because they've pulled stuff because of mounting congressional and media resistance to the war. The Pentagon has resorted to pulling things out of NATO, pulling things out of Korea, pulling things out of forces, earmarked for the Middle East to beef up the army in Vietnam. So they're short of everything. I talk about how in South Korea in the DMZ, the 38th parallel, for the entire Vietnam War, U.S. troops in South Korea don't have M16 rifles because there's a shortage of them because they've been given to American forces, but also to all the ARVN forces and the regional force, popular force militias. They're all getting M16 rifles. U.S. forces in Korea aren't. And then, we've got constant demands from, say, our Australian allies in Vietnam for helicopters. We can't give them helicopters because we don't have enough for ourselves. We have demands from the 47,000 South Korean forces allied with us in South Vietnam asking for stuff. We don't have it. And then the war, I show in the book how the war really breaks down because even the Senate Armed Services Committee, which is a real bastion of hawks, is people like, John Stennis of Mississippi, and Southern Democrat uber hawk. And then the Republicans are people like Barry Goldwater and John Tower. And these guys are just, rock solid in favor of the war. Their position throughout the Vietnam War has been, I will cancel the Great Society and the war on poverty, and I'll take that money and I'll put it into Vietnam in a heartbeat. I don't have any problem with the Vietnam War. I have a problem with the Great Society. So they've tried to suck funds from the Great Society to pay for the war in Vietnam. But that exercise has run its course. And they realized by 1970 that the war in Vietnam is eating all of the Pentagon seed corn. It's preventing the replacement of ICBMs with new missiles. It's preventing the replacement of warheads with the MIRV warhead, multiple independent reentry vehicle warheads. It's stopping the research and development into new generation of fighter aircraft because of the mounting costs of Vietnam. So that's when the guys on the hawks on the Senate Armed Services Committee, Republican, Democrat alike, say no. We have to get out of this war because it's ruining our defense posture around the world. So this idea that the war was we kept the gloves on and that we fought it too timidly, and if we'd only acted more energetically we could have won. We could have won by pulling everything out of NATO, by abandoning every other interest we had to fight this war. And that's the argument used when Johnson takes the decision to, basically not go for victory and not run for re-election in early 1968, basically his advisors, he calls in the wise men, people like, Dean Acheson and Douglas Dillon, and they sit around. And these guys months earlier had argued that we should continue the war. But then they look at the latest data and they just say there's no way for us to win this war. There's no way for us even to terminate this war. The only solution is to try to get the North Vietnamese to agree to some kind of deal. So, the thing is, and it's because in North Vietnam, we killed 1.4 million NVA and Viet Cong troops in the war. 1.4 million, and which is stunning given that only 10% of U.S. operations made contact with the enemy. Most of them missed. So it just goes to show that once we cornered elements of the VC or NVA army, we destroyed them. But they basically had uncommitted over 2 million males of military age, and they had 120,000 males reaching military age every year of the war. So there was almost no amount of punishment they couldn't absorb, and they had suppliers in the Soviet Union and China that kept the pipeline full. So they could prolong this war, and they had the political leadership that was absolutely ruthless and remorseless about shoveling these legions of young men into combat, and would go on until the mission was accomplished: national unification and a communist revolution.
Mhm.
So would you agree or not agree that the war in the first place was morally justified?
I think the war in the first place looked like a classic example of containment. You had a North Vietnamese communist state backed by Moscow and Beijing that was trying to push across the provisional frontier and annex southern Vietnam. And so it made sense to backstop the South Vietnamese regime with arms, with advisors, with development aid, and try to contain the spread of communism and set up Vietnam as an example of a non-communist alternative sustained by American largesse. That made perfect sense. That's why Eisenhower, why Truman pays 80% of France's war costs in Southeast Asia, and Eisenhower continues that policy, and then Eisenhower sends $1 billion in 1950s dollars of aid to arm and supply the ARVN and develop the South Vietnamese economy. A policy continued by John F. Kennedy and expanded by Kennedy. More advisors, more aid. I think that made perfect sense and was defensible.
Well, you say that, but most of us, or at least I and most of the people I know against the war, would challenge those assumptions that we had a right to be there, that our cause was justifiable in any sense of the word. It was an imperialist, racist, greed-driven operation. We had the French, we took over from the French. Are we now going to say the French had a right to be there and dominate them? That any imperialist country wanting to control the lives and seize the property of people in another country in the world have a right to do so because they're strong enough? So, I mean, that's why I was against it. And that's why most of the people I knew who opposed it, they opposed the very assumptions that this could, in any sense of the word, be a justifiable action of a country that I wanted to represent my views or to be proud of. It was a shameful, rotten endeavor from the get-go. It was not motivated by any sense of democratic rights or of humanity, of advancing the living standards of the poor, any basis that we look at. I see no justification for it whatsoever. It was an evil endeavor. That's why I opposed it.
Thank you, John.
Well, I sympathize with that view. I would just say historically, the way it was looked at was, you had a real clean break between, remember, Roosevelt dies in the spring of 45, is replaced by Truman. Truman has a totally different view of this matter. Roosevelt had been big on decolonization and had said, after this war, none of these European empires can come back. We're going to dismantle the Japanese empire, but we're also going to dismantle the British Empire, the French Empire. And that wasn't going to happen overnight, but that was he saw that as being a key part of the New World Order that would be created. And then these powers would kind of foster the development of the global South. Truman changes that because he's really worried about the spread of communism. And so he enters into this kind of Faustian pact with the French, thinking, okay, the French are bad, but the communists are even worse. And so we're going to support the French to stop the spread of communism. And then the French bail out. Eisenhower inherits this problem. Eisenhower says, this is the opportunity to put in this third force guy, Ngo Diem, who's neither communist nor French influenced. He'd gone into exile in the U.S. rather than work with the communists or the French when there were two states in Vietnam. So, and now he comes back to lead this purely Vietnamese movement. But, almost immediately, as you know, both the Eisenhower administration and then the Kennedy administration sour on Diem because they say, he's not this kind of, white knight who's going to come in and salvage the situation. He's a grubby politician who's, putting his family clique in charge of things and enriching himself and building a power base and building an authoritarian state. And so Kennedy kind of I think he would share your view that we're backing the wrong horse. I mean, there's no right horse because we can't back the communists, but he's like, well, this guy's not the guy either. And so he's having all the same doubts you're having that, it's not that it's an imperialist exercise because Diem is independent and Kennedy's very careful not to appear to be kind of his rich uncle. He's trying to kind of foster this independent state that will stand up, but all the money we put in is not really working. And so this all comes to a head a couple of weeks before Kennedy's assassination, when Kennedy very reluctantly okays the coup. And the reason he okays the coup against Diem and his brother New is that he hopes that this young cohort of ARVN officers, of South Vietnamese military officers, will come in and clean things up, turn the country around, put it on a more stable footing, and fight the communists more effectively. So there was awareness about all these issues you mentioned, especially in the Kennedy administration, less so in the Johnson administration. The Johnson administration just sees it as a test of will, and we just need to put in enough stuff to win, and then we can kind of pick up the pieces afterward. But Kennedy's really concerned about the appearance of this operation and how it will last, and what kind of state will be left behind, and whether that will burnish or tarnish America's image and that sort of thing. So there are, Kennedy's really thinking deep thoughts about this. But I will say that, he's constrained, like all of them, by the domestic political scene in the United States. You cannot run for president of the United States and be seen as being soft on communism, right? We've just emerged from the second Red Scare, after McCarthy's downfall. But that sentiment is still strong. The sense that we lost China, we can't lose Indochina as well. And so Kennedy has to sort of appear tough. But again, he thinks he's kind of found a way to thread the needle. And just before he's assassinated, he's given one of his principal deputies the task of exploring all options for Vietnam, including getting out after the elections in 1964.
Mm-hmm.
If I could, bloody Zoom, take my hand down when I don't intend for it to come down. Let me notice that currently we see a state, Russia, trying to expand its border into another state, and we have a very clear view on that matter. With the Vietnam case, we see a North state trying to expand its border. They're on their face, they seem parallel. I don't happen to think that the parallel is so terribly important here, but I think it is intriguing. If I could, and you know well that my experience in this was from inside the military. In fact, the ground troops, folks who get their asses shot off when they're up there at the point on some squad going into enemy territory. One thing I think is demonstrably clear, wins and winning a war depends utterly in the end on the spirit of those who come to that war, whether they believe in the war. Yes, it takes money and firepower and training and all those things. But if the will is lacking, guess what? You ain't going to get there. And this is my way of getting to what struck me so much in your initial thoughts and then talking to Doug. You said the war is not winnable. That, of course, is very striking. You ultimately then added that it wasn't losable either. But you said it wasn't winnable. And I heard two reasons, and I want to check how close I am on them. They both center around this point of the will to win. And of course, the US had turned against this in a way, so there wasn't any will, so that the sons of the middle class were being fed into this maw in a way that guaranteed the country was going to go into uproar and did. Let's see, what was the second point you made about that? Oh, yes. It really is the implementation of this point, namely that for McNamara to have ramped up, and you even suggest there were literally physical limits on being able to ramp up because of commitments otherwise, but for McNamara to have ramped up, he would have had to anger the country by sending many, many more middle-class sons into this war. But if I could check, is this the basic structure of why the war wasn't winnable? Because that really is an extraordinary conclusion.
Yeah.
It sounds right to me.
And it hasn't been, if you look at other histories of Vietnam War, nobody really mentions this. That's what I found to be lacking in so many histories of the war, is that they look at Vietnam in isolation, and they play it like some kind of strategy and tactics board game where you can just keep throwing more force into the equation. And they're like, well, America's so rich and powerful, we haven't even gotten started. Why didn't we do more? But there's hard limits because you have all these other global responsibilities. And they all have to be manned and defended. So you can't take from Peter to pay Paul indefinitely without having a preparedness crisis in every other regional command. And this is what happens in Vietnam. So in other words, there's nothing to take. There's no more reserve divisions sitting home in the continental United States that can then be earmarked for Vietnam. They're either gone to other places or they're earmarked for other places. Like if think about 1968, the Soviets sent troops into Czechoslovakia. There's a real worry that the war in Europe might spread. So Europe has to be reinforced. You can't take troops out of Europe and send them to Southeast Asia. There's also, strategists at the time. I talk in the book about how in February, March 68, there's this, McNamara, after trying to resign for months, and Johnson sadistically keeps him on. McNamara is a broken man. He's physically exhausted. He's close to a nervous breakdown, and he's been trying to get out of there. And Johnson keeps him on because he views resignations as betrayal. But the guy who's kind of tagged as the Secretary of Defense in waiting, and then takes over in the spring of '68, is Clark Clifford. Clark Clifford had a very hawkish reputation. He was known as Johnson's war minister, and it was assumed that Clark Clifford would escalate the war. Well, Clifford's smart guy. The first thing he does is he has two of his brightest subordinates sit down and do a review of the war. This is Paul Nitze and Paul Warnke, and they go through the whole thing, soup to nuts, and looking at available resources, money, troops, aircraft, bomb tonnage, and they go, this is unsustainable. We are just pounding money and troops and resources down a rat hole with no end in sight for a strategic object that is relatively unimportant. There's no way the United States should be spending this kind of effort on a marginal interest like South Vietnam. And so they argue for a complete handover of the war to the South Vietnamese, and a rapid exit from the war by the United States so that it can then refocus on its real priorities, such as keeping the peace in Europe and defending interests like South Korea. Because North Korea is getting stronger and stronger in this period, and looking at the situation in South Korea with this small, poorly armed American contingent. And that's why, 1968, you have the Pueblo incident. For 11 months, North Vietnam takes a U.S. spy ship and its 50-man crew and holds them hostage for 11 months. And Johnson can do nothing. He just keeps negotiating and they finally, after a year, they release them back to the United States. But he can't do anything because there's no residual force capability to launch an operation against North Korea to free those guys and to punish them for the act of seizing this American spy ship in international waters. So, and that's just a perfect example of how this war has sucked up everything.
Jerry.
As maybe some of my classmates took the same course, but I had the pleasure, and I use that in quotes, of taking strategic arms control from Henry Kissinger when I was an undergraduate. And I'm just curious, Jeff, what you think of his philosophy regarding Vietnam, because he told me I was basically an idiot. This was before Vietnam, but any time I questioned him, he questioned whether or not I really had the capability of even attending his class.
We knew that, Jerry.
Well, brilliant man and all, but I talk about him in the book as someone who really subverted a very promising peace deal that was coming together in October, November 1968. He was an informal diplomat. He was a professor of government at Harvard who had been picked by Dean Rusk, LBJ's Secretary of State, to go to Paris with Averell Harriman and participate in the peace talks. But he was Kissinger was an unreconstructed Republican, but he had backed the wrong horse. He'd backed Nelson Rockefeller, and he'd earned the ire of Nixon by writing op-eds against Nixon, and saying Nixon is the worst possible man to have a president at this moment, and that sort of thing. So Nixon was pretty sore about Henry Kissinger. So I read about this in the book that so Kissinger seizes and this is all new information. It came out in it was revealed for the first time in 2011. That Kissinger volunteers himself to the Nixon campaign, says, look, I'm embedded in the Johnson peace delegation in Paris. I can tell you guys what's going on. I can sabotage this peace deal if you'll let me on the team. And so, so Kissinger and, first Nixon wants nothing to do with Kissinger, but the team sees an opportunity. So they kind of put together this sort of back channel route via the South Vietnamese embassy in Washington, D.C. and by, Madame Anna Chennault, who'd been the wife of Claire Chennault, the guy who founded the Flying Tigers, was a big stalwart in the China lobby. And so they start talking to Chu, the president of South Vietnam, and they say, okay, no matter what what the Johnson team, led by Averell Harriman in Paris, brings to the table. Don't go and don't sign. So they basically sink the thing. And Nixon was terrified that there'd be an October surprise, a peace deal announced. Humphrey, who'd been trailing in the polls, would surge past him now that the war was history, and so he's trying his best to sabotage the peace deal. And so then Kissinger gets his wish. He gets named National Security Advisor in the Nixon administration. He gets to take on the war. And anyway, the story Kissinger always tells, and he's a very, I've interviewed him a couple of times when I hosted shows on History Channel. He blurbed my Franco-Prussian War book. He's a very kind of historically a very slippery figure, but the story he tells is that we had to stay. We couldn't just leave. We had to stay because we'd committed 500,000 troops, and it would be an intolerable affront to American pride and credibility if we just walked out and let South Vietnam fall. So we had to arrange a situation where the United States fights long enough and then puts in enough aid to sustain South Vietnam. And he says in an interview in 1967, what we need is a decent interval for them to fight on alone. And then when they collapse, the ignominy of that collapse will accrue to them, not to us, the United States. So that's what he said. He's saying, I'm thinking in grand strategic terms. You all are just sort of thinking in street level tactical terms and about your draft status or about your hatred of this war or whatever. But I have to be the kind of custodian of American power. And American power is big and timeless, and it cannot be stained by the outcome of this war. We have to arrange a just peace, an honorable peace, an honorable exit, that sort of thing. So he says all that, but what I point out in the book is that so the war goes on. Instead of ending in the fall of 68, as it might have done without his interference, the war goes on until January 73 for us. It goes on until April 75 for them. And the deal that Kissinger and Nixon get in January 73 is the exact same deal that Harriman was on the brink of signing in November of 68. It basically erases the DMZ as a border between the two countries. It allows the NVA to leave whole divisions of troops inside South Vietnam. It leaves everything, all sort of determination about the constitution of South Vietnam up to a joint communist South Vietnamese commission that will meet after the Americans withdraw. So it's the same deal. And yet we lose another 28,000 dead, hundreds of thousands more wounded, and tens of thousands more South Vietnamese dead. For something that if you look at it closely, it just looks like an effort by Nixon and Kissinger, by Nixon to get elected and Kissinger to have a prominent role in the new administration. And he'll keep this on to the end. He bludgeons Cambodia. When you talk about the killing fields in Cambodia, and was this Nixon? Of course, it was Nixon's fault. Nixon upset a delicate balance in Cambodia. This was a country that was neutral. The neutrality was violated, massively by the Viet Cong and the NVA because they were there. They were there on the scene. But they kept to the eastern part of the country. They had the sanctuaries along the border with South Vietnam, and they did not support the Khmer Rouge. They supported Prince Sihanouk, this neutralist government in Phnom Penh, and they said, as long as you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone. And so, Cambodia went on and was in the only. So then Nixon goes in and says, well, we're going to invade Cambodia, and we're going to tear up the sanctuaries. And they limit it with all kinds of rules of engagement because the domestic political protests at home are so great. So they don't do a whole heck of a lot. And then meanwhile, the NVA say, okay, all bets are off. And so, they unleash the Khmer Rouge. And then even worse, Nixon extends that bombing of the Cambodian border regions across the whole country. And once the Khmer Rouge becomes active, they bomb everywhere, right up to the gates of the capital, right up to the gates of, Siem Reap and Angkor Wat temples and all that stuff. So they just turn Cambodia into a moonscape. They uproot the whole population, thinking that they're supporting Lon Nol and fighting communism. but they turn the country into a desert and they turn it over to the Khmer Rouge. So I look at Kissinger's behavior in this war, and I don't really see anything positive about it at all. If he'd had a little more humility and modesty, he'd let the Johnson peacekeepers finish the war. It would have been better for all parties. But instead, he pressed ahead. And then even when he's in power, and after 1969, he keeps pushing this war. And when Nixon's trying to de-escalate, Kissinger's always trying to put in more force, and it becomes physically impossible, both because of the limits I described, but also because of congressional and public resistance to the war. But he's always saying, I need a stronger hand if I want to get a deal, which seems to be a case of just not understanding those limits.
And yet everyone
Could I
strategically brilliant. Lord.
I want to come back to the issue of the motivation for the war. Doug raised the argument that it was a morally justified war in some way or other. And I'm wondering to what extent that the people who advanced the war were motivated by anti-communism, or were motivated by a larger, as in Kissinger's case, larger strategic notions about China and Russia and the spread of power. I remember back in the mid-'60s, when I was at the University of Chicago, and Hans Morgenthau, who was the ultimate realpolitik person and far superior intellectually to Kissinger, argued that it was not in the interests of from a realpolitik position, because in fact what was going on in Vietnam was a nationalist a resistance movement with a long history, and had nothing to do with China, nothing to do with Russia, nothing to do with communism. And the truth is that once the United States was out of there and the war was over, what happened? Vietnam became an authoritarian, basically capitalist country. That's the country that makes our clothes now.
Not for long.
Not maybe not. But the whole. If you look at Vietnam now, it actually is the Vietnam that the Americans wanted it to be, no war was necessary to bring that about.
Let me jump in on top of what you're saying, David, because I have to go shortly, and I'm talking along some of the same lines, I think. When we were talking, one way to look at the Vietnam War is that the United States presence in it came out of Harvard. Most McNamara and a lot of those people came out of the Harvard that we knew. Secondly, there's a lot of different ways to look at knowing and how we know things epistemologically, like that Jerry was talking about with the brilliant. Who was it? Kissinger that said you're an idiot, and you're talking about role playing it out, Jeff. I approached it from a different epistemological point of view. That as a individual, I kept imagining myself as a Vietnamese farmer that was plowing his rice fields and getting napalm on top of me, and that's why I didn't go. And that's the kind of way that John and Doug were referring to, I think, also. So I think a lot of us are bringing a very different role play or gameplay to this, and maybe that shows our age. But and you know, knowing from your gut can lead into fascism, but it's also a somewhat reliable way to approach it. Period. And I'm gonna have to go in a second, but
Yeah.
I'm gonna pick this up later.
I'll have to go in 11 minutes, but you know, I think that in hindsight we can say these things, but we have to realize that all of these decision makers were prisoners of the times they lived in. So they were, and I don't mean that they lacked the courage to break the shackles. No, they're literally, their worldview was such that they didn't view it the way it's being described right now. In other words, they saw this as a case of communist aggression that had to be met. The difference was, how do you meet it? And as I said, Kennedy was someone who was very sophisticated at this point, but very aware of the threat from his right flank, that he had to project toughness, and he had to ward off a Republican challenge in 1964, in which they would say, Truman lost China and Kennedy lost Indochina, right? So he had to protect himself on that flank. So, and if he were just to bow out, he'd lose, and then some hawk would come in and deepen the commitment, right? So just by staying the course, he felt like he was giving South Vietnam a chance to stand up and fight. And if they failed, well, then they would hopefully fail after the 64 elections. He'd be in for a second term, and he'd say, "Look, I did the best I could do." And
He was the lesser evil compared to the right wing.
Right, is how he looked at it. And Johnson the same way, with the difference that Johnson really saw the war as winnable and was led to believe it was winnable by McNamara. McNamara is a fascinating figure in this war because, he's early on, he's gung-ho, and talks about how it's like impossible for us to lose. And, he and McGeorge Bundy talk about, Bundy, who was the youngest, I think he was then the youngest dean in Harvard history, and maybe still is. But they would talk about how, look, small slices of American power will suffice to win this war. But then by 1967, 2 years later, they're both completely pessimistic, and they realize their error, that the war is not winnable. And they're both arguing, and Johnson feels totally betrayed. He's like, wait a minute, you guys got me into this thing, telling me how easy it was going to be. And now you're saying we can't win. And so, they're all wrestling with real-time events that they've settled into a recognizable whole in the decades since. But at the time, everything seemed very fluctuating and up for grabs, and it wasn't quite clear what was the right course. But, the first paragraph of the book, I say this was a war of choice. And it was undertaken not for strategic reasons. It was undertaken out of fear of appearing weak, fear of people's political futures. And that's why I really castigate the role of Congress in this war. Throughout the entire war, Congress never stopped funding for the war until the very end. When they start cutting into Gerald Ford's appropriations for South Vietnam, and also when they crimped Nixon's ability to go into Laos and Cambodia. But for South Vietnam, unlimited. And so you have reliable majorities in both houses, Republicans and Democrats, who will not vote against this war because it will tarnish their chances at home with their voters, because they'll be called weak on national security. So that was the environment. It was a very hawkish environment, very anti-communist. And one of the other interesting thing is, despite the strength of the anti-war movement, is that Middle America, this term coined by the columnist Joseph Kraft in 1967, and in 1970, Time magazine makes Middle America its Man of the Year. Middle America, the 100 million conservative Americans of all classes, they still support the war right up to the end. So there's a lot of media outrage. There's a lot of student outrage, but there are reliable small majorities by the end of middle Americans who trust the president, trust the plan, trust the concept, don't like the waste, don't like the casualties, don't like the length of this war, but they assume that the president knows what he's doing.
Last question to Richard.
Well, I just want to say there's some fundamental issues that we just don't have time to deal with in this group. But I'll make 2 points. One is the notion that they didn't know any better because they were creatures of their time ignores the fact that there were always people in opposition who had a different view, and they chose not to listen to them. It's not that they didn't have an alternative. That's the first point. The only second point I'll say very briefly, I wrote this in the chat. The notion that this was North Vietnamese aggression against South Vietnam is, I think, not true. South Vietnam was not a real country. It was a colony of the United States created in violation of the French agreement to end the war, in their war in 1954, when the United States took over the effort that the French had given up on to maintain their colonization status of Vietnam. I used to know this history in great detail. 60 years is a long time to remember it. I don't remember it all. But I do know that the CIA undermined elections in Vietnam after 1954 for a unified country by creating this colony in South Vietnam. So this was not a question of one country invading another. This was a civil war that would not have existed but for the CIA.
But I would say that the rationale, the Eisenhower administration rationale for not holding those elections after in 1956, 57 was that look, if we hold these elections, they're not going to be fair elections because the North will just say 99% for Ho Chi Minh, right? And the North population was bigger than the South population. So the North will win by cheating. So what's the point of having elections? That's how they looked at it. And as for there were other voices in both the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. George W. Ball is kept on as he's known as the House eunuch because he's anti-war and he's very smart about showing how the defects of this plan, but nobody listens to him. And there's a scene, it's in David Halberstam's The Best and the Brightest, where Ball calls it correctly in the Kennedy administration. He says, Mr. President, if you continue this course, within a couple of years, we're going to have 500,000 troops in the jungles and paddies of South Vietnam, and we won't know where to find them. And Kennedy goes, "Oh, George, you're crazy. That'll never happen." So there were pessimists that were sort of pointing the way, and Kennedy just thought, "I'm going to be able to thread the needle here and preserve my credentials, national security credentials, but avoid this quagmire." And then LBJ, he comes to believe to trust Ball, but he feels so strongly that I can't be the first president to lose a war. A sentiment that echoed by Nixon later, that he's like, I've got to do something to win this war.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much for coming on. It was really wonderful. And
thank you all.
Thanks a lot. Okay.
I appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.
I spend the morning with you, or the afternoon, whatever this is.
Take care now. That was Geoffrey Wawro. He is a historian at the University of North Texas in Denton, Texas, and his new book is titled Vietnam War, A Military History. And that's it for this edition of the Last Negroes at Harvard podcast. We'll talk to you again next week.